My baby dolls, we're back again with another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today we got another great show in store for you. We got author Gerald Gems here, who wrote a fantastic book, which has just been published, I think, in February. It's called Before Jackie Robinson, The Transcendent Role of Black Sporting Pioneers. And we're going to be talking to Gerald in just a few minutes. Before I even get to the book, before I even get to Gerald, you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho, who is our producer. And the network has been growing. You can find me now on Giants Baseball. That's New York and San Francisco with Ralph. I've just joined the show last week, and it's been a very, very, very interesting time for me on that show. You can also find me on David Nemec's Old Time Baseball and Trivia with author David Nemec, and we're in the process right now of going decade by decade. I think we're up to 1951 this week, but stay tuned. We have a whole slew of other shows on baseball and sports and entertainment, and I invite you all to come to the network and listen, because it is educational, and like our authors and ex-ball players who come onto the show, we try to entertain through teaching. And Before Jackie Robinson, it is a book that teaches. And my thing is this: it doesn't start with Jackie Robinson. Never did, okay? Never did start with Jackie Robinson. Started many years before, around the time of the Civil War. This book is a collection of stories, of athletes, of culture. It is a sociology, and sports book. We're going to go into a lot of discussion of Booker T. Washington, W. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey. We're going to go into a little bit about each athlete that Gerald puts into his book, and it's going to be a very powerful, eye-opening show, I promise. Who is Gerald Gems? He is a professor in the Kinesiology Department at North Central College in Naperville, Illinois, and vice president of the International Society for History of Physical Education and Sport. He is the author of several books, including Boxing: A Concise History of the Sweet Science, and The Athlete Crusade, Sport and American Cultural Imperialism. And without any further ado, welcome to the show, Gerald.
Oh, thank you, Ian. Glad to be here.
Well, I hope I didn't butcher you too much. By the way, I got to get that boxing book and the Athlete Crusade. If you have copies of it, and we'll have you on the show again. I just had Jeffrey Sussman on my show a few weeks ago. He wrote the new biography of Max Baer, and I forgot the other boxer, the Jewish boxing book. A very good book. Was published also, I think, by Nebraska Press. Why this interest in African American history and sport by Jackie Robinson, Before Jackie Robinson?
Yeah, well, this book is actually the culmination of a joint effort. I didn't write the book entirely on my own, obviously, as you know, but all of these contributors are scholars who are part of the North American Society for Sport History, which is a major scholarly organization in the field of sport history. It's international. It says North America, but the members come from all over. And over the years, I had been the president of the organization for a few years. And, over the years at their national conference, I'd heard people giving presentations about these athletes, and I kept encouraging them to publish their work because, in their time, they were quite famous, but, their stories languished and nobody knows about them. And, everybody knows Jackie Robinson, but, Jackie Robinson didn't fall out of the sky as some angel and transform society, okay? The people that are covered in the book for, 2 generations before Jackie Robinson, starting in the, 1890s already and slightly before. We're making incremental changes in the society in terms of black and white relationships to be able for Jackie Robinson to be able to do what he did. I mean, he didn't just come down and change society all with one fell stroke by playing baseball. These things happened, on an incremental basis, year by year, for him to be able to be in that position. And then beyond him, for when you look another generation later, somebody like Muhammad Ali, had he done this a generation or two before, he would have been strung up and lynched.
And your book goes widely across the different aspects of sports that I didn't even know African Americans participated in, but I did know of the discrimination that they had to endure. Let me ask you this question. With the athletes that you put together in this book, did you have to leave anyone out, or were you able to put in as much as you anticipated to put into this book of those who made an impact on the various different sports?
Yeah, we had to make some choices. Clearly, I mean, the publishers have limits in terms of what's economically feasible for them, and so we did have to make some choices. So, I mean, the obvious ones that we excluded were people that are generally still well known by the general public. Jesse Owens, people like that, Joe Louis, great boxers. And there have been biographies of such people. Others who are lesser well known, like a Peter Jackson, one of the early great fighters, but there are biographies of him, or Joe Gans, other great fighters, who are all featured, though, in my boxing book. We did have to leave some of those out and concentrate on, a number of people, most from New York or Chicago, because those were the two biggest areas of black culture during the time period and had the most effect on the larger culture. And this is where most people gravitated to, either Harlem or Bronzeville in Chicago. So most of the athletes come from those areas. And also it depended on the expertise of the contributors, who were experts in their fields on these particular people. And so, to get a quality book, you need good contributors. You need people who know the stories and knew the background. And so, from that perspective, we were limited in who we could choose and who we did choose for the book. But we also, we tried to break it up between men and women, and also across various different sports as well, so that it wasn't just the concentration on baseball or football or basketball.
You had a whole bunch of contributors to the book. How long did it take you to edit it? Because you did edit it.
Yeah, well, with the publisher, they sat on it for about a year, and you probably know some of these things get delicate, and sometimes they want certain things and changes have to be made. But once they finally decided to go with the publication, it went pretty quickly. It took about a year after that to get all of the contributors in line, and for me to edit their work, get it back to them, allow them to make some changes to their stories. And once that was done, it went pretty quickly.
You know what? I'm going to start with Sam Ransom, because that was who you wrote about. Why did you write about Sam? And why don't you explain a little bit what he did?
Yeah, Sam Ransom, again, and he's somebody that nobody knows about today, but during his time, I did my doctorate dissertation on sport in Chicago, and I came across him at that time. And it seemed to me like, wow, this guy was amazing as an athlete. Why didn't he get more recognition? And so, I did a presentation on him, and I've tried to follow up on him throughout the years, and finally this gave me an opportunity to actually tell his story in this book. And so Sam Ransom was a high school athlete, an African-American in Chicago at a premier high school at the time, Hard Park High School, who happened to be there at the time, a bevy of just tremendous white athletes. But even years later, his own teachers and his own teammate who became quite nationally famous as a football American, Walter Eckersall, and then a sports writer for the Chicago Tribune, admitted that he was the best athlete. I mean, the guy won 16 varsity letters in 4 sports over 4 years. And while the rest of his team got recruited by, what today would be called Division I football powers, or University of Michigan in particular, right, and got college scholarships, he did not. Largely, it seems, because he was black, even though he was the best athlete, a star in not only football, basketball, baseball, and track. But in fact, he and Eckersall played together on a football team that won the Chicago City Championship, and then was challenged actually by a New York high school team. So this is maybe the first case of a national high school championship in 1902 already. The New York team came to Chicago and played. They played the game at the University of Chicago, right? And at the time, the game was played as really just mass plays. But the Midwestern teams, especially this Hyde Park team, they were quite fast. Eckersall was the state track champion. They ran a lot of end runs, reverses, things like this, and what they called an open game. It wasn't much of a game. They called the game, because of darkness, and the Chicagoans were winning 105-0. Okay, so the New York teams were upset by this. Charlie Ebbets, as you would know, of the Brooklyn Dodgers fame, offered that if the Chicago team would come to New York the next year and actually play their best team, claiming they didn't send their best team, that he would pay for it. They even hired a Chicago coach to come and coach one of the New York teams. So the next year it was a different team, well, not the Hyde Park team, went to New York to play. They called the game after 3 quarters because of darkness, and the Chicago team was winning 75-0. So what this brought in to the whole national game of football was a new style of play, getting away from these different mass plays were causing a lot of deaths, right, at both the high school and the college level. They almost banned the game. But anyway, to get back to Ransom, he was a major part of this. I think he scored 7 touchdowns in the game, right? But the papers wrote the stories about Ransom being the star player, not Eckersall or not these other guys. The Hammond brothers, who were recruited to Michigan, one of them becomes the Secretary of the Navy later in life. So Ransom's story is one of inequality. This guy was clearly the best athlete in all of these sports. His other teammates were recruited by big schools, University of Chicago, University of Michigan. He ends up at a very tiny school called Beloit College in Wisconsin, where, of course, he's a star athlete, but never got the recognition or the opportunities that went along with that, or the celebrity that brought, socioeconomic mobility and, economic power, such as the Hammond brothers or Eckersall, who was not a great human being. I mean, the guy was always in trouble, always never paid his debts. He played, a number of years at Chicago as All-American, put them on the map as a great football power under Amos Alonzo Stagg. But, when his senior football season was over, they kicked him out of school. He owed so much money. Whereas Ransom is this amazing individual who goes on to, again, he's not able to make a life as a professional athlete, as a black man. He gets a job in the Postal Service. He becomes a member of, black fraternal organizations. When World War I breaks out, and at this point he was old enough where he didn't have to join the service, but he does. He was working in Minnesota at the time. He comes back to Chicago and joins the Illinois Regiment. Most of the black troops were pretty much used like slaves. They were used as labor battalions. They simply, unloaded the ships and built the roads and things in France. But a few of the black regiments, I think, were loaned out to the French army. And Ransom is actually a black officer, one of the very few. They all had, almost all the organizations had, or the units had white officers. But Ransom was college educated. He was able to become an officer. He fought in the war and was wounded. One of the, I said, only a handful that actually got to experience combat. The other were the Harlem Hellcats for the New York Regiment. But when these guys came back to the United States, I mean, they had been to France. They had seen the more liberal conditions in France, a greater acceptance to a degree of African Americans in France than in America. They came back with their rifles, with their arms. And in Chicago, what happens is, 1918, there's a huge race riot. It goes on for over a week, almost 2 weeks. You know, I think 38 people are killed. You know, millions of dollars in property damage and fires. And it happened because even though there was a great influx of black refugees from the South during this time, they were still segregated. The beaches were segregated. And so there was a rope that distinguished the black side from the white side of the beach. A black teenage boy, you know, they had constructed a raft that had wandered, you know, the waves pushed over to the white side. He went after it, and white kids started throwing rocks at him, hit him in the head. He drowned. When the black kids complained to the white policeman on the beach, he sided with the white kids. Ended up in a big brawl, which carried over into the adjoining neighborhoods and throughout the South Side. As I said, it went on for almost 2 weeks. They had to call in the National Guard to come in and settle it. So these are the kind of conditions that Ransom lived in. He moved to Minneapolis, where he becomes a postal worker, joins civil rights organizations, and becomes much more of an activist in the early civil rights movement. And in fact, would be appointed by the governor eventually to what would be the Human Rights Commission in Minnesota throughout, you know, his later life. So sports was a way for him to gain early recognition, but it surely did not benefit him, and clearly not nearly as much as it did his white teammates.
And you know, Sam, you bring up a good point in your discussion of Sam. One of the things that you mentioned is the constant discrimination, which I spoke about earlier. But I want to talk a little bit about the three people who was instrumental in pushing back on discrimination and how their impact and their teachings had an impact on the sports and African American players. Let's start with Booker T. Washington.
Okay. As you know, Booker T. Washington was considered the figurehead of all African Americans in the late 19th century in America. He starts the Tuskegee Institute down in Alabama, but he's got a different ideology in terms of acceptance. He's the first black actually invited to the White House by Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt took a lot of heat for that. But the reason he was acceptable to many whites was because basically what they would have said at the time is he knew his place, okay? He didn't disrupt the social system of the time with the beliefs in white supremacy. He preached the idea that blacks should accept their role for the time being, learn a trade, learn an occupation, a career that they could contribute to the society, you know, in some fashion, to the economy, that they could accept their position and have a place in the American economy. He wasn't going to educate them to become business owners, become scientists, okay, to challenge whites in any way. They were going to be workers in the white economy, and this was acceptable to whites, all right? Along comes W.B. Du Bois around the turn of the century. He goes to Harvard University. He grows up in the North, so he's a free black. He's able to go to northern schools. He's a brilliant guy. He gets a Ph.D. From Harvard. He goes to school in Germany. Again, he sees conditions different in Europe, and he comes up with a different doctrine. All right, he's going to be more challenging than whites. It's called the Talented Tenth. He says those of us, all right, 10% of us can compete with whites or anybody else on the planet if we're given an equal chance. Right? And Ransom was one of these 10% that you could see, especially on the athletic fields, that he could not only compete but surpass whites, right? So sport was a way to try to overturn these doctrines or these beliefs at the time in white supremacy, okay? And so, especially in boxing, right? So when it's one-on-one, the belief was always that a white could always beat a black. You hit him in the stomach, they're going to give up. Okay? This was the belief system. And then you had, at the lower weight levels, actually in the 1890s, by 1892, black fighters beating white fighters and gaining championships. But that wasn't so significant because the ultimate championship, the symbolic of the toughest guy in the world, was always the heavyweight championship. And so when John L. Sullivan won that, and then his successors, James Corbett and Bob Fitzsimmons and all those that came after him, installed the color line. They would not fight a black fighter, even though there was one, Peter Jackson, who had fought Corbett to 61-round draw, but once Corbett became the champ and defeated Sullivan, he would not give Peter Jackson a shot at the championship, and no other white fighter would, right? Until Jack Johnson comes along, and what happens there is Jim Jeffries had retired in 1905 undefeated. Nobody ever beaten the guy, all right? So they hold a tournament to determine who's going to be the next heavyweight champ. The guy that ends up coming out of this winning is not even a heavyweight. He's more like a middleweight, Tommy Burns from Canada. And so he wants to capitalize on being the heavyweight champ of the world. He takes a worldwide tour, all right? And he's going to make a lot of money on this tour as kind of like the vaudeville circuit. Jack Johnson at the time was the so-called black champion, or at the time as they called him, the colored champion of America, but he couldn't get a fight with a white, especially not in America. He follows Burns around the world trying to get a fight, and a guy, boxing promoter in Australia, where Burns was at the time, offers Burns $30,000. That's a huge amount of money. And at this time, in 1908, and Burns says, sure, I'll fight him for that kind of money. And it wasn't a fight. I mean, Johnson just toyed with him. He destroyed him. He punished him. And so Johnson takes on all comers. Nobody can beat him. And so for 2 years they go on what's called the Search for the Great White Hope. There was a movie made about it. Okay. Any white fighter in the world, not just an American, anybody. The South Africans were sending people to try to beat Johnson. Nobody could beat this guy. So they finally called Jim Jeffries out of retirement, right? Nobody ever beaten him. They fight in the desert of Nebraska because no state would allow the fight to take place. And again, it's not much of a contest. Johnson destroys him, 15 rounds. Jeffries had never been knocked down. His nose is bloodied. He's, blood all over him. He's knocked down almost out of the ring a couple times. And they have to, call the fight. And they turned off the movie rights because they didn't want America or anybody in the world seeing a white man getting beat by a black. Okay, that's just the short version of Jack Johnson, because he goes on for many years and they can't find anybody to beat him. But clearly this, going back to Du Bois, this goes back to his doctrine that the talented can compete with whites in any field, any endeavor. And he's a Harvard PhD. He's an educator. Okay, he writes best-selling books. He gives, insight into the black culture and what it's like for a black man trying to grow up in white culture, right? And he's not the only one, as you would know. I've written other books, but clearly anybody who's not considered white, it wasn't just African Americans, okay? Jews were not considered white. Italians were not considered white. What most people don't know is Italians were the second most lynched group in America, right? How did these people become white? So that's a whole different part of the story that we don't cover in the book to any great degree. But all of these different groups had to establish themselves and gain what is known today as whiteness, okay, and acceptance in the white culture. It's got more to do than just the color of people's skin. Okay, so Michael Jordan has whiteness, Tiger Woods had whiteness, all right? Those types of things. So it's a totally different concept of how people who were once racialized and considered separate races, how did they become ethnic groups rather than racial groups? So part of the problem for blacks is still today they are still racialized as a racial group, whereas many of these other ethnic groups, such as Jews and Italians, Germans and others, right, have all become ethnic groups that are more acceptable in white society.
How about Marcus Garvey?
Garvey is important too. Garvey is actually a Jamaican who comes to the United States, and he starts, and it's during this period, which is covered in the book. Bob Douglas, one of the figures in the book, who becomes the manager of the Renaissance 5 Ballroom, the manager and head of the basketball team that would become the New York Renaissance, is a subscriber to Garvey's theory. So Garvey preaches in the 1920s, blacks, again, after World War I, are starting. You got all these great philosophers. You got all these great writers, especially centered in New York. You've got the Harlem Renaissance going on, black pride specifically, okay? And Garvey advocates the idea that, okay, we don't need whites. If they're not going to let us be part of the economy, let us have equal rights, we'll start our own. He's kind of an early proponent of the black Muslims that eventually Ali would become part of, okay? So he's preaching a separate black economy, separate black companies, a separate black culture. We don't need the whites, okay? We can get along without them. What happens to him? I mean, the American government cracks down on him. They deport him and send him back to Jamaica. Okay, he's seen as a rebel. He's seen as a rebel rouser, somebody who's inciting rebellion in the society, at least in the white, rebellion against white society and the power structure. And so he's basically kicked out of the country, similar to communists at the same time who were sent off to Russia, even if they weren't Russian citizens. Okay, you had anybody who was proposing communism as an alternative for poor people after World War I, so-called Red Scare. They rounded them all up and sent them off to Russia. So a little while later, Garvey gets sent back to Jamaica. So that's his plight.
And you know something that's very interesting? I think that was the Attorney General Palmer Mitchell, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, Red Scare. And again, people don't know the Russian Revolution did not end in 1918. They had a civil war that lasted well into the 1920s, even invading Poland.
What most people don't know is that some of our troops from World War I were sent to Russia to fight against them. And they did fight in the Siberia area and eventually were recalled. But that's a little-known chapter in American history that very few people know about.
Yeah, they were part of an international force. I think Wilson sent about 5,000 people into Vladivostok, which is on the Pacific side, whereas the British and French, I think, were in Murmansk up in the Arctic. They did, and it was all during World War I. A lot of people don't know that because, again, like your book, little known important details are lost to history. And you know what? Isaac Burns Murphy. How the hell do you forget this guy? You know, the guy he won 628 of 1,412 starts, a 44% victory as a jockey. How do you forget about this guy?
Yeah, how much money would a guy like that be making today, huh?
Especially with the gambling. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, here's a guy who should be an American hero. He clearly was the best jockey of his time. And, he upset, again, the white power structure because here's a black man. I mean, he's only the jockey, right? He's not the owner. Even today, the owners are the ones that make all the money. They get the trophy when the race is over. The jockey does the work. But he was still well paid. He was making $20,000 a year in the 1890s. That was an immense amount of money. And the white jockeys are jealous. They're upset with him. And, I mean, so they're trying to, push him off the course, knock him off his horse. His biographer says he was even poisoned by them. They made up stories, untrue stories about him being an alcoholic, and basically run him out of horse racing. You asked about people that we did not include in the book, but one of almost his contemporaries within that decade, right, was the American cycling champ. He had all the records. And he went through the same, but there have been biographies written about him. And so he went through the same process. Whites would knock him off the course. They would box him in and wouldn't let him out, just like, track runners might do to somebody today. He finally goes to Paris and he goes to Australia and makes tons of money over there and says, heck with you guys, I don't need America. But this is the kind of thing that the star black athletes had to deal with when they upset the racial order. And it was all part of these incremental, events that broke down this idea of white supremacy that Hitler would take to extremes in his Aryan supremacy doctrine, and which was still around in the 1930s, obviously.
It's such a stark, similar contrast when you think of it. Yeah, we didn't have concentration camps, but wouldn't the ghettos, wouldn't the lynchings, although not on a grandiose scale as in Auschwitz or a method of extermination, it was the same thing, living in shacks and ghettos. And here in your book, you're writing how they're trying to keep boxers from boxing African Americans and poisoning jockeys and doing whatever you can to put the African American down, and don't let them show their true colors, because, again, your book points out African Americans were shown as weak, as almost sex brutes who have no intelligence and are useless to society. How could they be seen beating white men in sport? And I think James Earl Jones played in the Great White Hope you mentioned earlier. Yeah, that's a film from the 60s, I think, 64.
Yeah,
65.
it's a ways back there, but it was, it's pretty powerful telling the Jack Johnson story, because even Jack Johnson, as much has been written about him, people have forgotten. I mean, to me, Jack Johnson was the first incarnation of Muhammad Ali, and was amazing, in his fights, because he destroyed so many white icons that he wasn't killed or shot. I mean, he had to leave the country for many years, and according to him, he claims in his autobiography, but there's a lot of exaggeration in that he made a deal with the government to give up the heavyweight championship in a fight that he lost to, and it had to be fought in Havana, Cuba, because he couldn't go back to the States, or he had to go to jail. Lost to Jess Willard. But he claims, and there's a famous photo of it, and again, we didn't include him in the book because his biographies, have been written by others, where he says, you can tell I'm not knocked out. I'm shielding my eyes from the sun as I'm laying on the on the ring. And there is a very distinctive photograph. Whether or not that was the case or not, we don't know. But he claims that he had a deal with the government, that he was able then to come back to the country, and that he got a big payoff. He says he threw the fight once he saw his wife get the payoff money in a bag, but he wasn't allowed to come back in the United States. So we don't know if there was really a deal or not. When he does come back in 1919, he's put in jail for a year, and he's never again allowed to fight for heavyweight championship. But it wasn't just boxing. He challenged whites in so many ways. He challenged the Indy 500 champion to a race in his race car. He lost, but he was still challenging whites all the time. He had marriages with 3 white women at the time, which was unheard of. I mean, there are other times he used to fly around in his fancy car. He wrecked one, and he had enough money to buy a new one the next day. He supposedly went through some, little rural town somewhere where the trooper stops him, and he stops him for speeding, and he tells him that's a $50 fine, and Johnson gives him a $100 bill. The guy says, I can't change this. He says, don't worry about it. I'm coming back the same way I went through. He was constantly challenging whites, and he could prove this idea of social Darwinism was not correct. There was no such thing as white superiority.
And you know something? Again, the time period, we're talking around the mid-1910s, a little bit before America's entry into World War I. You did have the birth of nation. D.W. Griffith's supposed masterpiece, which was considered the best war film up until the time of The Longest Day, which was made in 1962. But The Birth of a Nation definitely had its powers, especially on the Ku Klux Klan, who gained more momentum from that film. And
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly right. In fact, it's the first film actually shown in the White House by President Wilson to him and his cabinet members, which glorified the KKK. Blacks aren't acting in the film; they're portrayed by white actors in blackface, who portrayed blacks as villains. trying to run off with white women, rape white women, and they come, charging in as the heroes who are saving, white culture, white females. I mean, the whole depiction of blacks is just terrible in the film. And as you know, thereafter, it gives a big push to the KKK. The KKK becomes it resurrects itself. It becomes huge in the 1920s. I mean, the whole state of Indiana is basically made up of KKK members, including all the way up to the governor. The KKK, they obviously hated blacks and Jews and Catholics. The KKK in 1924, this is not in this book, but other work I've done, I've got a story about where the KKK marches on Notre Dame University in 1924. And they even threatened to blow the place up. It ends up in fights between the students, one of them led by the quarterback of the football team, who was one of the Four Horsemen. 1924, that season, Notre Dame then wins the national championship in retaliation and puts them on the map as a Catholic power. It's another way in which this whole not only racist but religiously oppressive white Anglo-Saxon Protestant society is broken down and becomes more American over the years. I mean, Catholics had to win their way just like Jews had to win their way into acceptability in this white power structure, the white Anglo-Saxon power structure. And there's something called hegemony theory, which I teach my students in all my classes. It's a complex theory, but basically it says in any culture you're going to have a dominant group, and they set the norms and the values and the standards for that society. And anybody else who's not in the group becomes a member of a subordinate group. You might have many subordinate groups. And there's a continual power struggle going on between those groups for power in the society. You can see this in politics today, right? And you can trace this very easily in America. The President of the United States is the most powerful man in the world, right? We've never had a female president, right? Until Obama, never a black president, never a Jewish president, never a Muslim president, and certainly never an atheist president. Only one Catholic president, and that was John F. Kennedy, and the reason he won was because Mayor Daley in Chicago, which was the deciding state, stuffed the ballot box for him. He was an Irish Catholic. So clearly the power structure in America has always been white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males, right? That's pretty clear. You can't argue with that. And so anybody who's not part of that group has choices. I mean, they can adopt what the power group wants to put into effect, or they can reject it, as we saw. And you can see this in sport. Muhammad Ali rejected it. The Black Power Salute in 1968 Olympics, Smith and Carlos rejected it, okay? You can see all kinds of instances of this in sport, whereas Jackie Robinson had no choice but to accept the white major leagues, but was able to work his way into that power structure and open it up for other blacks after him. So you see how the process works out in sport. Sport is very political. We use it in many ways today, even overseas, what we call soft power, right? And in fact, the book you asked about, The Athletic Crusade, is about how we've been doing this since the Spanish-American War of 1898 in countries around the world. How we, it's a lot more acceptable rather than, bombing people, sending in the military, taking over their land, and forcing them to live like we want them to live. We could just we send in sports teams or teach the kids how to play baseball, for example, right? Baseball teaches American value systems, whether you know it or not. Any sport is a form of competition, which is also the basis for our economic system, capitalism. So kids from a very early age are learning how to be good little capitalists, whether they know it or not. They take it for granted. Okay? It's a team game, right? And especially for immigrants that came over here. When you play baseball, and this is why baseball was a national sport, why it was taught in all schools, why it was taught in all park districts, taught in all playgrounds, especially during the immigrant era. Kids are going to learn democracy through baseball, okay? If the team's going to be successful, it requires some leadership, it requires everybody else to learn their role, right? It reinforces the capitalist system because for communal societies like Jews or Italians or others who didn't quite take to capitalism right away, especially if they were oppressed workers, okay, when you're playing baseball as a team, it's kind of like the family. We need all 9 members of the team to contribute if we're going to be successful. But, like in the capitalist system, on offense, we only each bat independently. And the guy that gets paid the most is the one who produces the most, right? Babe Ruth, all right, or the biggest hitter, Ty Cobb, are going to get more money than somebody else, just like the factory system. And the reason bosses sponsored many of these athletic leagues all over and had industrial teams of their own, they wanted the workers to learn one rule specifically. What happens if you argue with the boss? Well, in a ball game, the umpire or referee is the boss. You argue, you get tossed out. Same thing in factory. Argue with the boss. We got plenty of people waiting for your job in line. You're out of here. So kids are going to learn from an early age these basic values of the American capitalist economy and American democracy, right? And this is how they're going to teach them how to become good Americans, not like their radical parents who brought their ideas from Europe or elsewhere.
Let me just add and hedge upon what you just said. Number one, yeah, Woodrow Wilson did see the birth of the nation in the White House. What people don't know is that Wilson was brought up in the South. Wilson also segregated the American government. Anyone who works for the federal government will now be working in segregated rooms. Black and white always used to work together. Now they will get separate facilities, separate bathrooms, separate drinking fountains, separate kitchens, separate things. So Wilson was not a believer in racial justice.
No, not at all.
He adhered to Plessy, and you make two good points to the book. Again, I'm an attorney, and I also have my master's in history. You do give Plessy versus Ferguson, which was an 8-1 vote by the Supreme Court. The only dissenting vote was Justice Harlan, whose grandson was on the Warren Court back in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, who said that the majority of judges who ruled that separate but equal applied everywhere, not only on a railroad car, but applies everywhere in society, is colorblind. And that doctrine did not fall until 1954, 7 years after Jackie got into the league with Brown versus Board of Education, with new Chief Justice Earl Warren. But let's take a look at birth of the nation at this time. Let's see the Ku Klux Klan. Now, we're not only getting racial quotas and racial discrimination from them, like you mentioned, religious, being scorned. Now, KKK, when they marched on Washington in 1923, they all wore the white sheets with the burning crosses, whatever, but they held signs. KKK, no kikes means Jews, no coons means black, and no Catholics. So now the Ku Klux Klan expands, and like you mentioned, they were in every facet of government. Justice Hugo Black, who ended up being President Roosevelt's first appointment to the Supreme Court, and who would become one of the most liberal justices, voting for equality and literally serving 34 years on the term of the court up until 1971, a year after I was born. He was part of the Ku Klux Klan because he was a local judge. He was a local prosecutor, and he said that without belonging to the Klan, you could not get anywhere in politics. Now, throughout all this, we turn to one of my favorite subjects, the Negro Leagues. Let's talk about Rube Foster during this time.
Okay, so Rube Foster is another guy. We talked about Garvey, and this is the same era, the 1920s. As you know, the reason the Negro Leagues came about is because blacks were not allowed to play at the highest level in Major League Baseball since the 1880s. Okay, they were allowed to play against white teams in places like Chicago, I think probably New York, but not at the highest levels. Okay, so they had a lot of semi-pro teams. So the way Rube Foster's a Texan, he comes to Chicago first. He's a great pitcher, and hooks up with a black team. Right? He has enough business acumen that he actually becomes a part owner of the team with a guy named John Shorling, a white owner, all right, who has a baseball park. They are partners in this venture, and he's quite successful. He's quite astute. He learns the business side of things, and decides to go out on his own. Okay, so he's got his own black team, and there are a number of other black teams, which is, and again, part of this book is about the popular culture and the underground economy and all the types of things that are going on in addition to baseball. And baseball was part of this. A lot of the owners of black teams were numbers runners, okay, guys who ran the underground lottery for, within black neighborhoods and things like that operated every day and still do today to some extent, okay, because they weren't part of the regular system. But these guys made a lot of money. They invested their money. Some of them built ballparks. They were owners of teams. And Rube Foster says, okay, we can't get into, and this happens right after this race riot in Chicago that I told you about. He realizes whites aren't going to give them a chance, and again, given Marcus Garvey's promotion of a black economy, let's start our own league, right? He organizes the black owners into what he calls the Negro National League in the 1920s, all right? And it's quite successful. In fact, it's so successful that by 1923, a second black league called at that time the Eastern Colored League is formed. And so as a result, you get two prominent black leagues going on just like the National League and the American League for white players, right? And as you would know, probably, one of the excuses that the commissioner and others always claim was that blacks weren't good enough to play at those levels. Okay, well, I'm sure you're familiar with SABR, and some of the other groups have tracked down these things. Obviously they can't track down all the games between whites and black teams, but the black teams actually won about 60% of these games against white teams on the, on the baseball circuit, these traveling teams. And to give you some idea how good players were in the black league, clearly Satchel Paige was probably the best pitcher ever, but one of the guys who was upset that he was not, like Jackie Robinson, chosen to play in the Major League Baseball, being first anyway, was Josh Gibson. He was considered the black Babe Ruth. Josh Gibson, people talk about Babe Ruth hitting 60 home runs. Josh Gibson once hit 84 in a season. He's the only man ever, white, black, purple, or anything, to ever hit a ball out of the old Yankee Stadium. He also has the longest recorded home run ever hit in Pittsburgh. And, I tell my kids because it's similar, the old Pittsburgh ballpark are similar to Wrigley Field today, which is still standing where the Cubs play. And outside the right field wall of Wrigley, there are homes across the street. And behind the wall, behind that row of homes, is an elevated train track, all right? It was similar in Pittsburgh. Josh Gibson hit the ball not only out of the park, over the houses, but the ball landed on the train tracks, 614 feet. As far as I know, nobody's ever come close to that. This is how powerful this guy was, but he wasn't chosen to play in the major leagues. Jackie Robinson wasn't necessarily the best player, but he had the best psychological makeup to be able to withstand what Branch Rickey knew he was going to have to go through in the process. But these Negro Leagues were clearly capable of playing with anybody. They had fantastic players. Down in Dominican Republic, the dictator one time rounded up Satchel Paige and Cool Papa Bell. I don't know if it was Gibson, it was the other one, three of them that he brought down there. And he actually put him in jail so they couldn't carouse at night just to make sure that his team would win the national championship. Cool Papa Bell once ran, he's a great base stealer. He once circled the bases. They timed him on a muddy field yet in 13 seconds. This is how fast this guy was. To say these guys couldn't have played in the major leagues is ridiculous. But it was, as you stated, it was the social mores of the time, the social restrictions of the time, the segregation practices of the time, which had to be broken down incrementally, piece by piece, and that's what this book is about.
And I don't know if you're on Facebook. Am I friends with you on Facebook? I don't even know. If you want,
I have a Facebook page, but I rarely check it. Too busy with other things.
The thing is, I have a historical Negro League site on Facebook.
Okay.
And real people who are sons, daughters, nieces, nephews of all these great players, plus historians, the people from the Kansas City and Birmingham Negro League museums. They are all in my
In fact, one of the authors in the book, the very first chapter, the Isaac Murphy chapter. Pelham McDaniel
Mm-hmm.
III is a professor at Emory University, but before that, he used to run the Negro Leagues Museum in Kansas City. And
That's
one
right.
of my colleagues here at North Central College, a guy named Eddie Bedford, who was very involved in Negro Leagues scholarship as well. In fact, he might have even been president at one time. But he works here out of Chicago, and he's brought Minnie Minoso when he was still alive to school and things like that. But I've got a number of friends and acquaintances and colleagues who work in that field. Another professor here, he's actually a German professor, but his name is Greg Wolf. But he writes biographies for the Saber Project and the Negro Leagues as well. So
I want to step back. This will be the ending of my inquiry because I know you got to go. You got class in about another 20 minutes, and we're going to have another show on this book, as you realize, because I just pretty much scratched the surface of it. And there's so much more to talk about because I'm really enjoying the flow of this conversation and what people are going to get out because your answers are very scholarly and very important because a lot of people don't know about this. But now let's go back to Bud Fowler. And I always loved the story of Bud Fowler, but I did not like the fact that that's where all this started with the gentleman's agreement. Let's talk about Bud Fowler. Let's talk about the gentleman's agreement and the harshness for the next 60 years on white baseball.
Okay, well, actually, one of the primary guys involved with this is one of the first members of the Hall of Fame, right? Cap Anson, first guy to get 3,000 hits. And Cap Anson was the player manager of the team today we call the Chicago Cubs, but was originally called the Chicago White Stockings. It was in the 1880s, 1884, I believe, where they were traveling to Toledo to play the Toledo Mud Hens. When he shows up and they got a full stadium full of people already, he realizes that they got a black catcher. In fact, they got two black brothers playing the team, Moses Fleetwood Walker and Weldy Walker. Moses Fleetwood Walker was the catcher, and as they're warming up, he tells the owner of the Toledo team, "I'm not playing against any blacks." He was clearly a racist. And he says, "I'll pull my team off of the field rather than play." All right. The owner does not want to lose the money he's got sitting in the seats. All right. And so he pulls his players off. Every place that Anson went after this, he refused to play against any black players and there were several in the league at the time. Okay. You mentioned Bud Fowler, right? And then there were some light-skinned blacks who were able to sneak in for a while until they were discovered. Some even claimed they were Indians and things like that. And even those who were Cubans and Puerto Ricans, if they were light-skinned, they could play. If they were dark-skinned, they could not. All right? And so the owners would eventually reach this agreement that they would not hire black players to play. All right? This gentleman's agreement that you mentioned. Part of this was baseball didn't have a great reputation at the time. You had a lot of guys who were heavy drinkers, got in trouble. And so they were trying, just like they weeded blacks out of other areas, right? They tried, the owners, and Albert Spalding was part of this as head of the National League, tried to present, or wanted to present at least, a middle-class image of baseball to the American public to give it wider, not only acceptance, but also these are the people who have expendable income. And you can see the same processes going on today. There's this gentleman agreement to weed out all blacks from the league until Jackie Robinson comes along, right? They can play at the lower levels. They can be like Rube Foster and create their own teams, but they cannot play at the major league level. It reinforces this ideology of white supremacy again. The interesting thing that most people don't know about Anson, after he retired from baseball, he became one of the vice presidents of the American Bowling Congress, which was formed in Chicago in 1895. He also instituted in the American Bowling Congress constitutional laws barring blacks from participation in the American Bowling Congress. So blacks had to form their own bowling leagues, and as the stories are in the book as well, their own tennis leagues, their own golf leagues and tournaments. They were not accepted in white competition. Right, and Anson has a lot to do with this because of his celebrity, because of who he was, because he had political power to pull this stuff off, and he sets back the American society for at least 2 more generations.
And that's what happens with baseball. That's exactly what happened. I don't know if you know who Leslie Heffey is. She's the
I know
president.
Leslie Heffey. She's also a member of the North American Society for Sport History.
Yeah, she knows me very well. She's been on my show twice this year. Once to talk about the Encyclopedia of Women, and of course her masterpiece, which I consider the introduction to the Negro Leagues. The Negro Leagues, 1869 to 1960, and of course you just reaffirmed what she had talked about. Now, I'd like to end the show by saying that I'm going to want you to come back. Would you be willing to do that, to come back, and we'll talk about golf and flying with we're missing with Bessie Coleman. I mean, we're missing a lot of material here which is very important, which I'd like to cover. Would you be willing
I'd be
to
happy
come
to do
back?
that, sure. If we can arrange a day that's mutually convenient for us, I'd be happy to do it.
Wonderful. And also, I'll send you in the same email my address so you can send the other 2 books if you have a copy available, and we'll do another show because I think this is very important stuff that my listeners should do, should learn, and should talk about and should study because it is part of the American culture now. Besides Amazon, besides University of Nebraska Press, where can we find your book?
Well, it's available at Amazon online, and almost any bookstore you can order it through them.
And that's fantastic. Hold the line, Gerald. This is how I end the show, folks. We're learning a lot of things that happened before Jackie Robinson. I implore you to go out and buy this wonderful book, Before Jackie Robinson, The Transcendent Role of Black Sporting Pioneers, because you will learn a lot. You're going to even learn more than you learned on the show today. And we're going to have Gerald back on the show. Do yourself a favor. It's part of American history. It's part of sporting history. It's a very, very important list of essays and stories that will surely open your eyes. And as always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz, your host. A big thank you to Gerald Gems for being on the show today. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks, and good luck. We'll see you next time.